Welcome to Rubberneck Nation, your favorite chill spot to hear gripping true crime documentaries with a fresh perspective. I'm your host, Ann. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Join the nation so I can continue to bring you more gripping content. And of course, your support is greatly appreciated. Today's crime documentary features Mitchelle Blair. I know this story has been told thousands of times, and you've probably heard it before. Even I have watched quite a few videos and read all the stories, all of which inspired me to feature this story, but in a way, it has never been viewed before. I assure you, this documentary will be different. We're going to analyze the mind of Mitchelle to try to make sense out of this senseless, horrific crime. There is absolutely nothing that can justify these despicable acts. But as a society, it is important that we try to understand not only what happened, but how it happened so we can potentially save lives. So welcome to Rubberneck Nation, where we don't look away, we look deeper. It was March 24th, 2015. Detroit. A court officer enters a small apartment to enforce an eviction. In the corner of the living room sits an old white chest freezer. They open it to find a chilling discovery. Inside, 2 children, wrapped, frozen, stacked. 13-year-old Stoni Blair and 9-year-old Stephen Barry. Mitchelle, their mother, was hiding at a neighbor's house next door with her 2 other children. She was arrested and taken in for questioning. This is when we were able to understand what actually took place, and the details were beyond shocking. I recall watching the news clips and listening to the interrogation. I kept asking myself that same question that you may have asked if you also watched the news clips back in 2015. How could a mother do this to any child, much less her own? How could she unalive her own children, put them in a freezer, close the lid, and sleep night after night with them inside? Mitchelle's behavior was definitely abnormal, most likely psychotic. This is why we must dive into the mind of Mitchelle Blair to explore what happened to a woman who believed she was protecting one child by destroying the lives of 2 others. Mitchelle would become known as the Freezer Mom. But behind the headline was a woman whose life story was as disturbing as the crime itself. Before we go deeper into Mitchelle's story, let's pause to understand the city where this tragedy unfolded. Detroit, the Motor City, home to Ford, Chrysler, and GM, built on steel, chrome, and rubber. Vast factories stretched for miles, and luxurious office towers rose downtown along the banks of the Detroit River. Detroit was the industrial powerhouse that put America behind the wheel. In 1950, Detroit was the thriving hub of the American automotive industry and the 5th largest city in the United States. Detroit was the symbol of American manufacturing and prosperity. Auto factories offered high-wage, blue-collar jobs, though the industry was already volatile. But that was then. Now, Detroit is better known as the capital of the Rust Belt, a city hungover from a half-century industrial party that ended in layoffs, shutdowns, and bankruptcy. What once symbolized muscle cars and middle-class dreams became more synonymous with crime, riots, urban decay, and suburban flight. This was the backdrop Mitchelle lived in, a city of contrasts, the shadow of what it once was and the harsh reality of what it had become. A place where hardship was common, pain was often invisible, and survival was the only constant. Mitchelle was certainly a product of this environment, and as a single mother with what some may consider alleged deadbeat fathers, economically she struggled. Before the headlines, Mitchelle Blair looked like any other woman. In photos from her younger years, she seemed vibrant, smiling, even playful. A single mother of 4, trying to hold her family together. But the truth was, she was struggling. She lived in low-income housing, often behind on rent and bills. Her children, 2 girls and 2 boys, were rarely seen outside. Teachers noticed the absences. Social workers had been called more than once. And behind all of that was another silence. The fathers of Michelle's children were largely absent. Whatever role they might have played in offering stability, discipline, or even just presence wasn't there. Michelle carried it all, and for a woman already fractured by her own past trauma, that weight was crushing. So when the storm came, and that it came through Michelle alone, with no partner, no real support system, no balance, no mental health help, no voice of reason. The rules of her house were hers and hers only. And as we'll see, those rules became absolute and absolutely fatal to her kids. When the investigator asked why did she do this to her kids, Michelle didn't begin with her children. She began with herself. As a child, she said she had been abused, and when she told her mother, the response was cold and dismissive. Her mom said, "It's over with. What do you want me to do about it?" That response cut deep. That dismissal became the wound she never recovered from. And this is where we need to pause, because what Michelle carried was more than pain. It was deep, festering trauma. When listening to Michelle talk about the pain she experienced as a child, you can hear the anguish in her voice. Michelle was mentally ill, though she didn't want to admit it, and certainly did not want anyone to think it either. But any sane person who cares to look beyond her crimes can tell something was off upstairs. This does not make her less responsible for her actions, but it does explain the factors that influenced her behavior. Let's take a moment to explore one of these factors: psychological trauma. Psychological trauma is an emotional response to a distressing event or situation that shatters your sense of safety. Traumatic experiences often involve a direct threat to life or security, but sometimes it's not only the event itself, it's the silence afterward, the dismissal, the isolation. While most people may eventually recover from trauma with time and the proper support, if untreated, others continue to experience it like a wound that never closes. The symptoms may fade from the surface, but inside, the fear, anger, and mistrust keep growing, awaiting the right trigger to fester up into something explosive. Michelle never healed. She spoke often of abandonment and betrayal, by her mother, by a father she never knew, and by the men who cycled in and out of her life. That anger ran deep. She admits she spoke openly, and in my opinion too openly, with her own children about the abuse she endured. She cited that the worst thing you can ever do is touch someone inappropriately. To her kids, she described her experiences as a youth in detail and warned them constantly, "If anyone ever touches you, you tell me. If you ever touch one another, I'll know, and you'd better never do it." In her mind, this was protection, but in reality, it was the transfer of her unhealed trauma. Her children didn't grow up with normal boundaries or in normal loving conditions. They grew up under the shadow of her pain. So when her young son used 2 dolls to act out what Michelle believed were inappropriate acts, she didn't see a child's imagination. When her son accused his siblings of abuse, she didn't take the proper steps to investigate it. She didn't even think that perhaps they are children, and they may not understand what they are saying or doing. She saw betrayal. She saw the predator from her past. She saw demons, and age did not matter to Michelle. Michelle said they knew exactly what they were doing. While Michelle claimed she was of sound mind, she clearly wasn't. Unfortunately, in extreme cases, untreated trauma causes mental illness, and someone with a mental illness cannot think logical. Their reasoning is grossly flawed. When the judge asked Michelle if, when she was physically harming Stephen, was it also her intent to inflict serious mental harm, Michelle literally did not know what the judge meant. Michelle asked, "What do you mean? Like mentally damage him? Beat him in the head or something?" The judge clarified. She said, "Like making his thoughts not right." Michelle responded, "No." I gasped, as Michelle did not seem to understand that physically beating a child to the point of absence of life, throwing hot water on their genitals, and starving them, in fact, also creates mental anguish. You see, in Michelle's twisted reasoning, she believed Stoni and Stephen deserved to be unalived, especially Stoni because she was older. To bring this full circle, Michelle's actions may have been to prove to her youngest son that she is not the type of mother that will look away. She saw herself in her youngest son, and she definitely did not and would not allow him to grow up thinking she did nothing to protect him. She was going to deliver the justice that she never received. Michelle is not the only culpable party in this tragedy. One question lingers. Where were the fathers of these children? When the case went to court and the focus shifted to parental rights, prosecutors didn't just focus on Michelle. They also looked at the men who fathered her children, Alexander Dorsey and Stephen Barry, and what the court found was damning. In legal terms, fathers are expected to provide support, protection, care, and consistency. But when it came to Dorsey and Barry, none of those words applied. Instead, the court used words like abandoned, deserted, forsaken, relinquished. Stephen Barry admitted he had no contact with his children for well over 5 years. At the time, his son, Stephen Jr., was tragically unalived. Barry was incarcerated. But even after his release, he made no effort to confirm his son was alive. Alexander Dorsey's absence was no less devastating. While his daughter Stoni was being beaten, starved, and tortured, he described himself as simply living, eating, sleeping, going about his life with no concern about the welfare of his children. The court concluded both men had abandoned their children, not just the two who were unalived at the hands of their mother, Mitchelle Blair, but also the two who survived. They failed to protect them from Michelle's abuse. They failed to even check if their children were safe. They failed to provide love, care, and support. And so, Michelle was left the sole authority in that home. One fractured, angry woman with no partner, no counterbalance, and no one willing to intervene. In the end, the children were not just abandoned by Michelle's violence, but by their father's silence. Stephen Barry owned up to his part by saying in court he could have done more to save them from the apparent abuse. He teared up and expressed remorse during the second day of trial in the state of Michigan's request to terminate the parental rights of Blair, Barry, and Alexander Dorsey, the father of the other two children. At the time of his court appearance, Barry owed thousands of dollars in child support. He also shared his son, when alive, expressed anger towards him, and did not want to see him. Even at 9 years of age, little Stephen felt the absence of his father and was clearly emotionally impacted by that. The sad truth is, the fathers didn't care, and this is inexcusable. They abandoned their children and left sole and absolute responsibility of their care to an unstable woman, which both fathers acknowledged Michelle had serious anger issues, yet claimed they were unaware of the potentiality of abuse. I doubt this was true, and so did the courts. As a result, the Wayne County judge ruled it was in the best interest of the living children to terminate parental rights for all three of the parents, Mitchelle Blair, Stephen Barry, and Alexander Dorsey. At the time, the oldest, who was at the eve of turning 18 years of age, had the option to interact with her father in the future. A child trauma expert said that both remaining children would need a lot of therapy. In Michelle's twisted logic, she thought she was protecting her youngest son, but instead her actions caused him severe trauma, terror, and neurological issues. When crimes like this happen, as a society, we often ask, was the perpetrator mentally ill? Earlier, I stated that Mitchelle Blair was mentally ill, and I am sure many of you disagreed with that statement, and that is okay. Actually, you are correct. Mitchelle was not allowed to plead mental insanity or claim she was mentally impaired. As a matter of fact, she boasted proudly that she was of sound mind. But was that really the case? This is by far the most controversial perspective of this case, and we're going to unpack it together. To do so, we need to examine the legal versus human life definitions of mental illness. As you listen, I encourage you to weigh in with your thoughts in the comments. Those of you that believe Mitchelle was of sound mind, your conclusion is correct according to the law. The legal system has a very narrow definition. If you know right from wrong and can understand your actions, you're not legally insane. So Mitchelle was never going to qualify as insane. She hid the bodies, she articulated her reasoning, and she understood the consequences. But the actual human experience of mental health is much broader than this. Someone can be legally sane and yet be profoundly unstable, irrational, and unsafe to society. Mitchelle clearly lived in that space. Personally, I don't feel Mitchelle discriminated when it came to her feelings about inappropriate touching. She would have unalived anyone accused of such actions in relationship to her kids. But I digress. Let's continue. Our next focus is transparency versus sanity. Mitchelle was transparent about what she did, but that doesn't make her mentally stable. It shows conviction inside a distorted framework. Her logic made sense only to her, and that is what instability looks like, living in a mental courtroom where you are judge, jury, and executioner. The courts and also society only acknowledge mental illness when it meets a clinical diagnosis and courtroom definition. But what scares me is there are millions of people who never meet that threshold and yet cannot function safely or rationally within society, and we usually don't acknowledge it until something tragic happens. Mitchelle's case begs us to examine this. Mitchelle was volatile, traumatized, and violent, yet not insane, at least not legally, but definitely not mentally well either. So let's ask ourselves, if anyone has the capacity to take another human's life, absent self-defense, are they in a healthy state of mind? I'll let you answer that question for yourself. It certainly doesn't mean they're less guilty of the crime, but it does mean something in their psyche is broken, like their moral reasoning and their ability to be rational and logical. Also, in Mitchelle's case, she did not have empathy or self-control, so perhaps it is all of the above. If we look beyond the legal language, if we ask what does a stable, healthy human being looks like, Mitchelle would not fit that. She was unstable, volatile, and even lacked the basic reasoning skills that keep people within the bounds of societal norms. This is the blind spot. If someone knows right from wrong, the courts say they are sane. But what about the people who aren't technically insane, but they certainly aren't mentally well either? People like Mitchelle, who live in a distorted logic that only makes sense to them. These types of individuals present a clear and present danger to society. And I think perhaps we don't talk about that enough. So what are your thoughts? Is Mitchelle mentally unstable, or was she just consumed by rage and faulty logic? Or is it possible she was both, or better yet, is Mitchelle the epitome of pure evil? I want to hear from you. Let's talk about it. Share your comments and perspective. As you consider Mitchelle's mental state, I'd like to share another observation pertaining to Mitchelle Blair's state of mind and the likely impacts of deep-rooted, unhealed trauma on Mitchelle's mental state. Mitchelle had a deep-seated hatred and loathing for inappropriate behaviors, especially involving children. This kind of loathing doesn't come from nowhere. As stated earlier, Michelle's hatred was born out of her own childhood. When she believed her children had crossed that line, unfortunately, she didn't just see kids. She saw the person who had once destroyed her, and she felt that pain, due to her wiring, the fact that these were her kids just wasn't registering. For all my Wire fans, I have a great analogy to bring my previous point to life. If you've ever seen The Wire, you'll remember the scene where Chris Partlow viciously beats Bug's father. If you haven't seen the critically acclaimed HBO show The Wire, I encourage you to watch it. There's a specific scene I'd like us to focus on. For those of you that may not have watched The Wire or you need a refresher, Christopher Chris Partlow is a fictional character on The Wire. He is the main enforcer and a bodyguard to Marlo Stanfield, an up-and-coming drug lord. Chris takes Michael Lee on as a protege. At Michael's request, Chris and Snoop take care of the situation with Michael's stepfather, if you know what I mean by that. When Chris confronts Michael's stepfather, Chris questions him about being inappropriate with little boys and asks him about any past activity in prison. After Michael's stepfather dismissively admits to having had man-to-man activities while locked up, Chris proceeds to beat him to a pulp. The viciousness and fury Chris unleashed upon Michael's stepfather was in stark contrast to the business-like, poised way in which he usually unalives people. You see, it was implied that Chris, too, may have been SA'd as a child. And it was later confirmed by series creator David Simon that both Michael and Chris were victims of SA. In the dark alley of the scene, Chris wasn't just avenging Michael, he was avenging himself too. The adult Chris defended the inner child that could not protect himself. Now, how does this relate back to Mitchelle Blair? No, Chris did not unalive his own kids. But the rage he inflicted upon Michael's stepfather is the same rage Mitchelle inflicted upon her two helpless kids. In Michelle's warped logic, she wasn't punishing her children. She was punishing her abuser, her mother, the silence of this type of trauma that she carried all her life. To be clear, I'm not excusing her actions, nor is Mitchelle any less culpable. She definitely deserves to be locked away for life. David Simon did a phenomenal job of showcasing in cinema exactly how trauma, left unhealed, can fester into destructive behavior. As for Mitchelle, she was defiant to the very end, even sharing that some of the most heinous crimes in this world have been by kids. And she went on to say that she doesn't care what America thinks. In God's eyes, we all sin. So don't throw stones. Another sad example of a weak attempt to deflect and rationalize her actions. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was pointing the finger back, casting herself as judge and executioner once again while accusing the world of hypocrisy. Mitchelle was sentencing to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I don't know if the verdict and sentencing truly provides justice in this case. What about the parts of this case that didn't get nearly enough attention? The part often left unsaid, the silence of others, the fathers who were absent, the grandparents who weren't there, the school system and social workers that didn't check on the welfare of these kids. Whatever reasons they had, their absence left one fractured woman with total control over 4 children, and no counterweight to her distorted judgment. It certainly doesn't absolve Mitchelle, but it adds to the tragedy, because in a different world, with a different balance of voices in that home, maybe those children wouldn't have ended up in a freezer. This is why true crime is never just about one person. It's about the ripples of trauma, of neglect, of absence, and what happens when no one steps in to stop it. It is about the tragedy of these kids.
If you found this content compelling and you'd like to see more, don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm your host, Ann, signing out until next time. You've been listening to Rubberneck Nation, where we don't look away, we look deeper.